Was it worth it? Was Africa's first ever annulment of a presidential election worth it? 10 weeks later, the opposition is boycotting this time, and Kenya's Supreme Court, the same that cancelled the August 8th vote, failing to muster the needed quorum to hear an appeal on postponement. This on the eve of the rerun. This while another court condemned further improprieties at the IEBC, the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, accused of being not so independent. Its chief IT director was murdered in August. And most recently, one of its commissioners resigning and fleeing to the United States, fearing, she says, for her life. And so Kenyans, who a month ago were cheering a cancellation seen as a win for rule of law, are now left to ponder why they're not having a fair and square fight at the ballot box. How does one of Africa's emerging giants finally overcome decades of political rule by the same families since independence, with the same patronage and vote-buying systems on the campaign trail, say critics, and the same ethnic rivalries that nearly triggered a full-scale civil war a decade ago? Today in the France 24 debate, Kenya is on edge, and we're talking about it from Nairobi with Larry Maddow, a tech editor and columnist at newspaper The Daily Nation, and also present on NTV television. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. We
also want to welcome Julia Wono, who runs the Africa desk at Internet Without Borders. How are you?
Yes, I'm fine. And I'm the executive director.
Executive director, yeah. Excuse me. Congratulations for the promotion. From New York City, we're joined by academic and political commentator Nanjala Niabola. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, the president of Kenya spoke a short while ago. This in rebuttal, you might say, to the head of the opposition, Raila Odinga, in Nairobi, calling on his supporters to stay home Thursday.
Do not participate in any way in the sham election. Instead, we advise Kenyans who value democracy and justice to hold vigilant prayers away from polling stations or just stay at home. We are aware that the bloodthirsty regime is planning to use every excuse to massacre our people. Let us deny them that chance.
Yeah, Kenya's president responding a few hours later on national television, and in a conciliatory tone, saying for all to respect each other's wishes. You can stay home as long as you respect the rule of law. He also spoke, Uhuru Kenyatta, about what would come next, saying when all this is over, we'll work to make up for lost time.
We must and we will ensure that the benefits of our nation's progress are felt by every Kenyan, and that our nation's journey to becoming a modern 21st century country gives every Kenyan the opportunity of pride and prosperity.
Uhuru Kenyatta speaking there, and I've got to say, I'll start on this one with you. With Larry Maddow, there was a bit of a 180-degree turn in the remarks by Kenya's president. He said that that decision by the Supreme Court that was taken last month was, quote, the sign of a maturing democracy. Of course, on the campaign trail, Uhuru Kenyatta had blasted the judges. What was your reaction when you heard that?
It is very strange that he would classify it as a sign of a maturing democracy when just a couple of months ago, maybe 2 months ago, he was very understandably livid about that decision by the Supreme Court in Kenya. He called them crooks, the judges, and he took every opportunity to castigate them at every chance he had. So this climb down today by the president is one of the strange things that has happened in a truly strange season for President Kenyatta, because his conciliatory tone, like you mentioned, Francois, is evident, but he completely sidesteps the issues about the credibility in this electoral process, which is why the opposition, NASA, is boycotting the process, and they've asked their supporters not to turn out and vote tomorrow because they believe, as currently constituted, the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission cannot carry out a free and fair election by the admission of its own chairman and that one commissioner who resigned and flew to New York.
More broadly, what did you think of the tone? Because he did at one point allude to the dark days of 2007-8 when there were hundreds, if not thousands, who were killed in ethnic bloodshed that followed another disputed presidential election. This time, he was much more conciliatory. Larry Maddow?
Right, yes, he was conciliatory, which is a good thing. But like I said, there's a lot of other issues which this one statement does not handle. There's his own party, which enjoys a majority in the Senate and the National Assembly, and he's famously said from the same state house that they have such an overwhelming majority they could even change the constitution without needing the opposition's help. And that is seen as a sign of early signs of dictatorship, which is something that a lot of civil society groups, the opposition, even some within his own party are uncomfortable with that kind of language. So conciliatory, obviously, because it's on the eve of an election, which he is widely expected to win. If the people do go to the election like they will tomorrow, they will largely be supporters of his Jubilee party. They will vote for him. I suspect that he will win with 80–90% of the vote cast. So this is a sign and maybe an attempt to start looking at that statesmanship that has been so lacking from his campaign, which has been just as divisive as the opposition has had.
Nanjala Nyabola, we heard earlier from the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, calling it a sham election, calling on people to stay home, not to go out and try to protest at polling stations. Nonetheless, he did also say in that speech that he wants his political party to become, and his political coalition to become, quote, a resistance movement. How do you interpret that?
It's hard to interpret at this stage. It's still very early days. It's an interesting tactic, and it's one of the many things that have happened in the last 3 months that it maybe couldn't have been foreseen until we were actually in the moment. He hasn't quite clarified what this resistance movement, A, will be resisting, B, what tactics they'll be deploying, and C, what they expect the ordinary person, what they expect their contribution to be to this resistance movement. Is this a political resistance to the stuff that's happening in the legislature? Is it a resistance to, some of the things that we're seeing happening with regards to civilians? Is it, this movement sort of to raise awareness about some of the extrajudicial executions that happened after the August 11th result was announced? So we're still very early to tell what it is that Odinga has in mind with this. But if I may, I wanted to just respond to the question that you put to Larry, because it's something that I've addressed in some of my own work, which is President Kenyatta sounds very different when he's speaking in English than when he's speaking in Swahili or when he's speaking in his local language. And we saw this very clearly when on September 1st, when he was first responding to the Supreme Court decision. When he was speaking in English, he was very conciliatory as well. He said, I don't like it, but I respect it and I accept it. And barely 3 hours later, he was in the streets of Nairobi calling the Supreme Court justices crooks. It's not been a long time. It's yesterday, members of the Jubilee Party, 2 days ago, members of the Jubilee Party were again saying that they would, quote unquote, handle the judiciary once the election was over. So there's also a little negotiation there that's happening that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, just on the idea of this boycott, Julia Wono, you and I know the list is long of African opposition leaders who boycott votes. For a few days, people say, oh, will this call into question the legitimacy of the president? And then, well, people kind of forget, right, that the election was boycotted.
Yes, and also legally, although Odinga has declared publicly that he would not rerun during this revote, legally he hasn't even filed the form that removes him from the list of candidates. So it indeed feeds the idea on whether people will remember that there was a boycott at the end of the day. But what's interesting here is that really Kenya is, we are going from the constitutional historical step that was praised almost 2 months ago now by several observers, by several citizens and other states within the African continent and elsewhere, to a political deadlock and crisis where we wonder where we're going, as it was said. What is the movement that is proposed by the opposition now? What does it mean to boycott? What do we do once we boycott? Will the Supreme Court nullify another election? Does it have the power to do so now that the Parliament just adopted several set of amendments limiting the power of the Supreme Court to nullify elections, and specifically specifying that in case irregularities does not substantially affect the election, there is no need to rerun the election. So it's certainly, well, there's a lot of uncertainty in this election, obviously, and it's not even surprising because most of the issues that were raised on September 1st and then that were detailed in the September 20th decision of the Supreme Court have not been dealt with. We're talking about the IEBC composition, which is still pretty much the same, except for those members of the commission who have fled abroad, and specifically that lady who was fearing, fearing for her safety, allegedly, and also, the judicial power itself, represented here by the Supreme Court, which did not even make it to the court, could not gather all the quorum necessary to make a decision on the idea of rerunning the election or not. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but at the same time, it was not unexpected, unfortunately. Yeah,
let's talk about the legal power plays that we've witnessed on what's been a very long Wednesday for Kenyans. First of all, this reaction on the hashtag F24 debate. Half feel it's undemocratic. The other half feel they need to exercise a democratic right. What exactly is democracy, asks this one viewer. Larry Maddow, when the day began, the front cover of your newspaper, the Daily Nation, ran the headline, "Intrigue and Court Fights, Hours to the Polls." That was the front page headline. And of course, we've had a surprising turn of events with only 2 out of 7 Supreme Court justices showing up. One who stayed home, the Deputy Chief Justice, Philomena Mwilu, after her driver was shot the previous evening. What are your thoughts on the mood when that court convened and then, failed to muster the needed quorum?
It's been a dramatic day. I think that Daily Nation front page best exemplifies the feeling in the country. This political drama is something like we have never seen, and we've gone through a very violent post-election season. How do you explain 2 Supreme Court judges saying they were unable to come to court? That is not an explanation. That does not work in any office. Can you tell your boss, I'm unable to come to work today, and that's okay? I don't see any alternate universe in which that's acceptable. In this case, like the opposition lawyer, James Orengo, who is also the senator for Siaya, said this was not an accident, it was not coincidental that 2 Supreme Court judges were unavailable mysteriously. Another 2 were out of town or just unable to make it to court. It is one of the many growing scenes of intrigue in this election, in a day that has not been short of drama, from one court case to another and then to another. And Kenyans are honestly exasperated because whether you support President Kenyatta's Jubilee or Raila Odinga's NASA, you do see that not all of these things are happening in a natural way. There are some invisible hands that are pulling levers here and there and making sure that they get their way. So that's how the day has turned out to be. Tomorrow might just be another one of these political dramas. House of Cards is nothing on this Kenyan election.
Nanjala Nyabola, your thoughts on, again, 2 out of 7 Supreme Court justices showing up?
I think it's a massive disappointment. And I think that, especially with the reasons that were given, when one of the Chief Justices said that she couldn't find a flight back to Nairobi in a country that has some really elaborate private aviation companies. I mean, you can hire a helicopter from Wilson Airport for $2,500 for a full day. So the idea that she was unable to find a flight to sit and determine something that really has massive implications, not just this year, not just for this election, but for the future of the country, it's a really significant disappointment and a real abdication of responsibility. I think it adds to the uncertainty. And I think that the idea that getting Kenya out of this uncertain period rests solely in the hands of Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta is very unnerving to me, because the rest of us have to live in the country as well. The rest of us have to share that country as well. And this was an opportunity for the judiciary to sit and say, look, beyond the political claims, we can't tell you who to vote for. We can't tell you when to vote for them. But what we can tell you is this is what the law looks like, and this is what we should be done within the parameters of the law. That's really all they had to do. They didn't have to declare a winner from the bench. So it is really disappointing. It adds to the uncertainty. And I think it also, in the long term, it undermines the integrity of the judiciary, because it says if the most senior judges can opt out of cases that they find to be uncomfortable or politically complex, why should a little person, seek out that support from the judicial system?
Yeah, and just how strong Kenya's institutions will be going forward, we'll put that to our panel. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information. Everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24, a different take on the news.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. No heir apparent as Xi Jinping concludes a Communist Party Congress by unveiling a new Politburo Standing Committee that's beholden to China's most powerful leader in decades. Tens of thousands of mourners turn out at the start of 5 days of funeral ceremonies for Thailand's longtime monarch, King Bhumibol. Donald Trump blasts critical Republican senators over Twitter. This after one of them, Arizona Senator Jeff Flake, compared the current U.S. political climate to that of the McCarthy era. And the death of a pioneer of rock and roll, New Orleans native Fats Domino recorded such classic hits as Blueberry Hill, Ain't That a Shame, was 89. Of those stories and more for you. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Kenya is on tenterhooks on the eve of a rerun of the cancelled August 8th presidential election. That one was because the Supreme Court had deemed there were just too many irregularities. This time around, well, after the cheers of those who said that that ruling by the Supreme Court was a victory for rule of law, right now, there's the anxiety ahead of a poll that's being boycotted by the opposition with fresh accusations of intimidation on both sides. And with us to talk about it, Larry Maddow, tech editor and columnist at newspaper The Daily Nation, and also of NTV television fame. Joining us from New York, Nanjala Niabola, academic and political commentator, and here in the studio, executive director of Internet Without Borders, Julie Awono. In the opposition stronghold of Kisumu, protesters burned tires earlier in the day after the Supreme Court decision not to rule on postponing the elections. In the past days there, voting materials for the rerun had to be brought in under close guard, and there's apprehension ahead of Thursday.
This is the biggest polling station in Kisumu, where almost 20,000 people are voting. But because of the expectation, people, even the IEBC, they are afraid to erect tents. People are so hostile, because of the expectations.
I am personally requesting you to come out and vote, because our nation is tired. It cannot be that from January to December, we have forgotten about our work because of politics.
All right, so that was a message on the campaign trail. That one in Swahili. Nanjala Niabola pointing out in part one of our discussion how sometimes President Kenyatta's message is not the same whether he's speaking English or one of the local or national languages. And in that message, he talks about, well, an election fatigue. Larry Maddow, the president certainly has a point there that Kenyans are tired of this electoral limbo.
Kenyans may be tired of the electoral limbo, but there's a good percentage of the country that is happy to be in this electoral limbo for just a little longer if we can guarantee that the electoral process will be one that will be credible, will be free, will be fair, and will be without interference from political parties, from other outside interests. Because this talking point President Kenyatta and his Jubilee Party have of we are tired of electoral limbo, we need to get this so we can move forward, which he said again in his address to the nation this evening, is very, in a way, simplistic and forgets all of the important issues that are being raised, not just by the opposition here, by the way, but also by different envoys, ambassadors from different agencies, observers, civil society groups, trade unions, and religious organizations who are concerned about the obvious challenges of credibility that this electoral body and the process will have if it is allowed to go on, and it will go on tomorrow. So just trying to go to an election for the sake of it so that we can move on and have these problems recur every election cycle, or even worse, have an outcome that is disputed, is not good for the country.
But Larry,
certainly not good for building institutions
here.
and building public trust in them.
Larry, speak truthfully here. Do you feel that Kenya had the means and the backbone for a rerun? Because critics say that, an election in Kenya, that means money for campaigning, money for patronage, and that, well, coffers were empty for a second go.
Elections are expensive by design. Anywhere in the world, elections are expensive. And the space did exist, and the time possibly did exist 2 months ago when the Supreme Court made this ruling September 1st. Because right out of the gate, outside of the Supreme Court steps, NASA came out and said, listen, we have certain challenges with this electoral commission. They have said that before the August 8th election. And if the Supreme Court did agree that the level of irregularities and illegalities committed in the last presidential election rose to that level that it invalidated the outcome, then that should have been the time to begin making some of those changes to guarantee an outcome that can be trusted. But if none of that was done, and they said, no, the Supreme Court said there was no fault, the Electoral Commission or the chairman of the Electoral Commission, and we should go ahead and do it again, then we end up in this situation where with just literally 10 hours or less to the presidential election, one half of the country does not feel they can trust the outcome, and therefore they will not participate in it.
Giulio Ono, you have a legal background. The president, in his speech before the nation on the eve of the poll, saying, hey, I just want to respect the Constitution. The Constitution says 60 days, no more, if you want to do a rerun of an election.
Yes, that's very interesting because everybody claims that he or she is respecting the Constitution. And at the same time, we have members of an independent electoral body claiming that they are scared for the security and that they fear that they are not that independent. We have judges, the judicial power, which is not anymore above the political parties and steps into the political debate by basically not making a decision, a legal decision, reminding the law whether we should rerun, on what basis we should rerun the election.
But critics also say that the Supreme Court added to the confusion because you remember when they canceled the vote, they then waited a long period of time to explain that ruling, and even some say that explanation was not satisfactory.
Satisfying. Well, at least the ruling opened up some questions, which basically we're talking about governance and transparency, and all the questions raised by the Supreme Court in the ruling seem to touch on some of these issues. For instance, how the composition of the electoral body and how the results were transmitted. We still, although an audit was done of the company which was awarded the contract for electronic system voting, except for that audit, the IEBC has not given access to its system to say NASA representatives, for instance. At least that's what the NASA is still claiming until today. So really, I think all the debate here is boiling down to one single issue. If Kenya is to be a democracy, so where is transparency? Are independent bodies and independent judicial authority right to be scared and claim that they fear for their security? And I think it's a challenge, a democratic challenge for Kenya and for the rest of the region as well, whether the continent and this region is able to, on the one hand, choose to fully enter the 21st century by choosing electronic voting to ensure as much transparency as possible. But at the same time, this does not mean that issues which exist and which have been existing for decades, in some cases, are still existing as of today.
Nanjala Niabola, let's cut to the chase here. Do you regret the cancellation of the August 8th election?
No. You asked me to cut to the chase. I cut to the chase. No, I don't. I think there are a lot of little details that are getting lost in the conversation about this cancellation. The first thing I'll say is it's important not to collapse the legal plane and the political plane. There are things that happened on the legal plane that were necessary and important, and there are things that happen in the political plane that are beyond the control of the Supreme Court justices. What happened on the legal plane was accurate and correct. There is nobody who understands election law in Kenya and the background and the history of why we have the most complicated election law in the world who thinks that what the Supreme Court justices did in September was wrong. It was one of the most grounded in law decisions and I watched almost every single hour of the court proceedings. Even lawyers for the IEBC and for Uhuru Kenyatta fumbled and had moments in the courtroom where they could not justify why certain things happened in the August 8th election in the way that they did. Everybody who knows the law knows that it was the right call to make, to tell everybody, let's go back to the ballot box, let's go back and do it properly. What the Supreme Court didn't say was that we needed to rebuild the election system from scratch between September 1st and whenever the election date was going to be. What the opposition did that was very disconcerting was that they overplayed their hand. They asked the IEBC for more than what the court had said had to be done in many ways. Many of the irreducible minimums were, if they were comfortable with these things in August 8th, why were they suddenly uncomfortable with them in the rerun? And but that's not a legal question. That's a political decision that was taken by the NASA coalition. And that shouldn't be pinned on the justices who, have no control over how people take their decision and run with it. If you separate the two planes, you really do start to see that there was some kind of misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what the court said that had to be done next. And the people who are really at fault in all of this, to be honest, were the commissioner, is the commission. Because what they should have done if they were uncertain, if they were unsure, if they needed clarification on how these things should be read together, they should have asked for an advisory opinion much earlier on. Waiting until 3 days before an election for someone to submit a petition before the court just adds to an unnecessary sense of drama that people don't really need right now. Yeah, they should have said.
A further layer of confusion. I want to bring in at this time from Nairobi, cartoonist and political commentator Patrick Gathara. Many thanks for joining us here in our conversation on the France 24 debate. You just heard Nanjala Niabola say, despite it all, she has no regrets over the cancellation of the August 8th election. Do you agree, or is this a case now on the eve of this uncertain, boycotted rerun, one step forward, two steps backwards for Kenyan democracy?
Well, thanks for having me. I totally agree with Nanjala that the annulment itself was a great step forward. And I think what's happened afterwards has really been more an example of the state trying to claw back the sorts of powers, I guess you'd say, that it feels it lost to the new constitution. We have to remember that the what made the September 1 annulment possible was the new constitution. And there has been a lot of disquiet amongst the political elite about the way the constitution redistributes power and the new centers of powers that it creates. And I think that I wouldn't fault the opposition too much for what has happened since then. I think they were well within their rights to say that the court did identify that the processes that were used during the August 8th elections were at fault, whether they were the electronic processes or simply how IEBC itself disregarded law. And I think they were within their rights to say that things needed to change. We couldn't go in with essentially the same makeup and the same setup and expect a different result. And I think that the bigger share of the blame, to me, goes to the people in government and who have, over the whole period, essentially tried to first change the law so as to legitimize and legalize the wrong things that the IEBC did, but also put tremendous amounts of pressure on the courts and on the IEBC itself to resist any form of change that might lead us to having an actual credible election.
Well, let me just turn to Julia Wono here. Do you think that the way the courts they've been under pressure, as we've said, nonetheless, there was that annulment of the presidential election. Would that have been possible in your native Cameroon?
Very interesting questions. For now, historically, there hasn't been an equivalent to this, although there have been lots of disputed elections, of course, but a Supreme Court never had to nullify the result of an election. So obviously, the ability for a Supreme Court to nullify an election is a sense of the good health, or rather good health, of a country and of a democratic country, to be more precise. So obviously here, once again, this step was very important for a country like Kenya, which is indeed one of the giants of the continent. But at the same time, it seems that it was totally unprepared, and that's absolutely normal. It's a course of history, and I think it's a movement that is being built. It's also a word that, as it was said by Nanjala, that the debate will have to go further beyond this single election.
All right, so let's go further.
Issues, absolutely. Let's go further.
Let's go further and just talk about also where Kenya, you do have a disputed election. You do have this dispute between the party in power and the opposition. You have had peaceful changes of power. If you look at the electoral map, though, from the August 8th poll, it tells a tale that's familiar throughout the continent. There are areas where the incumbent got 70, 80, 90% of the vote, and others where Uhuru Kenyatta got less than 10. A lot of that down to, well, not ethnic allegiances, the fact that so many people in one place can be like that. And then, of course, there's the fact that you have the son of Kenya's first president against the son of the late historic opposition leader, Oginga Odinga. Tell me something. Let me ask you, Larry Maddow, why is it that you have these two families that rule over Kenyan politics?
I don't think it's unique to Kenya. There are political dynasties in many other countries. I believe in the US, we've seen two Bushes in office. In Canada, the same, in lots of other places on the continent. Part of it has to do with the fact that Uhuru Kenyatta's father was president, obviously, and Raila Odinga's father was vice president in the independence government. And there's a certain level of maybe loyalty that people feel to them, and generations therefore ascribe to these families. It's almost as if you're born of leadership pedigree, which obviously is nonsense, but a lot of people subscribe to this kind of notion, and I don't think it's unique to Kenyan politics. People find this problematic. A lot of people think it might be time for a change, to have new political players come into the national discourse.
Is there any sign of that, though?
And maybe gather enough of a following The possibility of it happening, I think at this point in this generation might not be that immediate. There have been people who have attempted to appeal to a younger generation, to a millennial crowd on social media and all of that. They didn't go far enough. They didn't get enough of a support to even rank in the presidential elections past. Most of them didn't go beyond maybe 5% of the total votes cast. So that is a problem which maybe there might need to be a changeover when President Kenyatta and maybe Raila Odinga, if he becomes president or bows out of the race, might begin to create room for other families that were not born in dynasties, for people who were not born into political families to stand a real chance of becoming leaders at a national level.
Nanjala Niabola, the day when we'll see new faces, is it near or far away?
It's inevitable, because in 2022, Raila Odinga will not be eligible to run, and neither will Kenyatta. So it's inevitable that we are going to have to start to think about who takes over after this generation is done. But I also wanted to respond to something that you said before about statistics and how it's important to underscore that when we were in court at the Supreme Court, the IEBC disowned every single statistic that came out of the previous election. The Chief Justice asked the lawyer directly, what were these numbers? And he said, well, I don't know what these numbers were. They were just statistics. So even the stories that we can tell from those numbers, it's not clear what they represent. Do they represent someone's preferences?
But they do resemble the voting patterns we saw in 2013.
Yeah, but 2013 was 5 years ago. And the population of Kenya has gone up by, I think, almost 6 million since then. You know, things have changed considerably in specific parts of the country. Northeastern Kenya, for example, flipped completely. Before, they voted, Wajir, Garissa, and Mandera all voted pro-Jubilee URP at the time, and now they've all, pro-NASA, sorry, and now they've all flipped. You know, there are significant parts of the country that did flip following the election. This idea that Luos and Kikuyu, or that ethnic group, or Raila and Kenyatta, constitute 50% of the country obscures a lot of really rich detail. And you know, between the two of them, it's less than, between the Luo and the Kikuyu ethnic groups, that's less than 40% of the country's population. And the rest of the country is still there and is still part of this political conversation and is negotiating their space differently. But yes, to go back to the original question, absolutely, it's inevitable. The question is, are we ready for it? Are we ready for 2022? And looking at everything that we've seen in the last 2 months, there's reason to be concerned, and there's reason to be paying really close attention to what handovers happen in all the different political constituencies.
Patrick Gathar, we're out of time, but in one sentence, are you more concerned or hopeful now when you look to the future?
Well, I'm a bit of both. I've got to say that the fact that the Supreme Court had taken the decision to annul the election gave lots of us hope that the Constitution can be implemented, that we can have a new way of doing things. But it's inevitable that we were going to get a blowback from the people in the regime who want to retain privileges that they're used to. And I think that going forward, if we can focus more on fixing the fundamental problems we have with the way our state is structured, we still very much have a colonial state that sort of has a veneer of democracy on top of it. If we can actually get to grips with the historical problems that our colonial experience created, that we have glossed over for the last 50 years, then we can actually start making good steps and actually retaining and consolidating them. What the Supreme Court did was to give us an opening. It's up to us now to go through the door and to insist that those who are trying to shut it are out of the way.
Patrick Gathar, I want to thank you for joining us from Nairobi. I also want to thank Larry Maddow. I want to thank Nanjala Niabola for being with us from New York City. Julia Wono. It's time now for Media Watch. Enter Haxie Myers-Belkin.
Hi, François Picard. I'd like to start with this tweet by a woman called Martina Stevis. She's the Africa correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Kenya election body says vote tomorrow is to proceed as planned. despite, of course, those court gyrations.
Gyrations, that's a good word.
It's a good word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Opposition supporters at Uhuru Park disagree, however, and you can see them there in their trademark orange tops and caps. Now, what are these people waiting to see? Well, of course, it was an address by the man himself, Raila Odinga. Odinga did announce that he was withdrawing from the repeat election on the 10th of October, 2 weeks ago. But we heard once again here, that he's calling for a mass boycott, of course. That's not surprising in the slightest, because he expects the upcoming repeat election to be marred with inconsistencies, irregularities. Essentially, he's saying he expects it, as do his supporters, to be rigged. Now, he reiterated that call for a mass boycott, but he also announced that his national super alliance, NASA, that we've been hearing a lot of course, had transformed from a political coalition to a resistance movement. And unsurprisingly, his supporters took that up quite enthusiastically. This Twitter user, hashtag Uhuru Park, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. Now, Odinga did call for peaceful protest, but the NASA coalition tweeted its own rather ominous message. The primary responsibility, if the worst occurs, lies squarely with Kenyatta. Now, of course, this worst they're referring to is a reference to the post-election violence 10 years ago in 2007. I don't need to remind you that 1,300 people were killed, over 500,000 people displaced. So that's a rather ominous message from NASA, if you choose to read it that way. And while there are reports of running battles between police and pro-Odinga protesters in the city of Kisumu, which is one of Odinga's heartlands, Maggie Fick, who is the East Africa Deputy Bureau Chief for Reuters, has been posting some interesting tweets today. She says that, by and large, Odinga supporters are listening to his calls for calm. We will follow what he said. This is, she's recounting a conversation she had with a motorcycle taxi driver. We will follow what Odinga said. Tomorrow we can't vote, no protest. Tomorrow we'll be in our houses. And actually there's another picture that she tweeted there, as was the case in the August.
The motorcycle taxi driver.
I'm not sure it's the same guy. Wow. It's quite a few of them in the city. Right. But as was the case in the August 8th vote in Odinga's heartland, his words are law and are immediately responded to on the street. Now, this is the sort of headline you see across Kenyan media today. The reason, of course, that Thursday's vote is going ahead is because not enough Supreme Court judges turned up for a hearing on whether or not to delay the election. 2 out of a possible 7 judges did turn up. So here's a bit of reaction from pro-Odinga civil society members, with 2 judges indisposed, one unavailable and one under house arrest. Kenya's Supreme Court has basically been disbanded by force, says this one. Disbanded
by force? Well, that's...
strong stuff.
All right.
And a similar sort of sentiment from a man calling himself Boniface Mwangi. Chief Justice and 1 brave judge showed up in court today, but there was no quorum. Bribery, blackmail and death threats kept the rest away. And he also, in another tweet, says yesterday the bodyguard of Kenya's Deputy Chief Justice was shot. That was a warning shot for her and every single Supreme Court judge. Mafia tactics.
Of course, we don't know yet. It could have been a robbery. We don't quite know yet why the person was shot, but a lot of people are interpreting it as an act of intimidation.
Absolutely, we are. And a man called Professor Nick Cheeseman, he's the founder of democracyinafrica.org. He also highlighted the timing of the attack. He says that it's sad to see an issue like the quorum settling the question of the election rather than a reasoned legal argument, especially given the attack on the Deputy Chief Justice's car.
And of course, it reminds people of the killing of the IEBC's IT man before the August 8th poll. Haxi Myers-Belkin, I want to thank you. And we want to thank you for joining us here. More coverage of Kenya on our website, France24.com. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 debate.